we're introduced to another judge, Jephthah. And he's introduced in this way. We know his father. His father's name's Gilead. We know that's his dad, so we can, if you were a historical Israelite person, you could track him down to his father. But we actually don't know his mother because the Bible introduces her as a prostitute. And this is an important detail. It tells us immediately the social place this person, Jephthah, occupies in his family. Because he grows up in the household where he belongs biologically. He has his dad, but he's not relationally accepted. So Jephthah leaves. He leaves. They push him out and he leaves. And out of the margins, he gathers other men like himself, displaced, restless, unwanted, men with little left to lose. And the text calls them worthless men. And this is who Jephthah surrounds himself with, these worthless men. This is the phrasing in the Bible. And together they become something like a militia, or maybe like a roaming band of fighters. Now the story continues that when Israel finds itself threatened by the Ammonites, they're in the disobedience and there's a consequences cycle of events. Suddenly the people who once pushed Jephthah away now beg him to return. Come save us. They know he's a valiant fighter. They're like, we need you now. Just earlier, they didn't want to share any inheritance with him, and didn't want him around, but now they're begging him to come back. They're begging him to come back because they see how strong and good of a warrior he is. It's actually remarkable how quickly people rediscover your value when they need you. So the elders answer, yes, we do need you. Save us. If you can do this for us, you can be our leader. And he agrees. Now, as you read the text on your own or with your home church, you need to know this part of the story. Because there's already something uneasy going on here. At this point in the story, unlike earlier judges or the judges we've kind of heard about already, there's no explicit divine leading or word yet. Only political negotiations, family dispute, there's some governing things that are happening. There's a survival and human arrangement that's happening. There's no God saying, Jephthah, you do this, people, you do that. It's people crying out in disobedience and then acting in the world of how they understand it to work to get a strong warrior to save them. God is actually not speaking or commissioning anyone yet. But before, as the story goes on, he begins the battle, Jephthah actually does something really wise. He tries diplomacy. He doesn't just go to war against Ammonites in the story. He tries to reason with them. He sends words to the Ammonite king and says, essentially, like, why are you attacking us? Why are you doing this? You have your land, we have our land. Why are you doing this? And they respond saying, like, well, actually, the land you have was originally our land. And, Joshua, way back, who was the leader of Israel, he took it from us, so we want it back now. And Jephthah hears them out, but answers surprisingly without anger. But he does this whole diplomatic history lesson with them. He retells the story. He responds that Israel, actually, the land didn't actually belong to you. This is a territory that came through a different conflict. And Israel has lived here now for generations. So, keep your land and we'll keep our land. You do you, we'll do us. Just chill. But the story goes on to tell us that the king of Ammon ignores his words and he's preparing for battle. And this is where we finally read that at that time, the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah. So here at last, after being kicked out of his family, then being begged to come back, after having this whole diplomatic negotiation that doesn't work, in this moment, the Spirit of God is upon him. And this is a clear message that the authors really want us to catch. God is now here. God is now upon him. Meaning nothing more is needed. God is here. Which is why what happens next in the story is really unsettling. But he makes a vow that's never been asked of him. Nobody is looking for this. God is here. The Spirit of God is upon him. Yet he says, if you give me victory, God, if you give me victory over the Ammonites, I will give to the Lord whatever comes out of my house to meet me when I return in triumph. I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering. He has all he needs. So this is shocking and foolish vow because Jephthah speaks as though God needs to be persuaded. And this is an important moment that reveals something about him and Israel to us. Earlier, when Jephthah speaks to the king of Ammon, he sounds thoughtful, measured, and wise. He understands how the world works. Right? He did the diplomacy. He essentially says, let's not fight, because historically this land was not taken from you unjustly. Your people came against Israel. Israel just defended itself. He's being really wise here. He knows the history and he knows the information. But in that same conversation, he also says something that now we need to highlight to help us make sense of this vow. Because in that diplomacy and in the conversation, he says to the Ammonites, you keep whatever your God Chemosh gives you, and we will keep whatever the Lord our God gives us. The political diplomacy now turns theological. Jephthah reveals to us in his negotiation that for him, God is simply one more God among many. Jephthah has absorbed the imagination of the nations around him. So he assumes God must work the same way, as though divine help must be purchased, as though victory requires leverage, as though God is actually not trustworthy. So he hedges his bets by leveraging his position. He tries to secure from God what God has already began to give him. Now let's just pause here for a moment. Because again, it's easy to look at these characters and shake our heads at them. How could they not know? Didn't God constantly tell them, like, put this on your hands, on your foreheads, wholeheartedly understand this, is I'm different, I don't want this. Why would they do this? But the critical part of the Bible, as we have been learning each week, is that it works like a mirror to our own lives. Jephthah tries to secure something from God even though it has already been given. This is so significant in the story for us. Because when you no longer know God's heart, you can do harmful things while believing you are being faithful. Because what we do reveals the kind of God we believe in. And if we do not understand God's character, we may still invoke his name while living in ways that do not reflect him. And maybe that's actually some of the point in all of this. The deeper problem in Judges is not simply the violence, although that's a big problem. But it's actually the people increasingly cannot tell the difference between what God desires and what God disapproves. And the author wants us to see this and feel this tension in our bones. Jephthah simply does not know God. He acted foolishly with assumptions about God. But yet there's another layer in his ignorance. And the authors expect us to kind of know this. Now, there is 613 laws in the Old Testament, so you can be forgiven if you don't know all of them. But one of the things we learn in them is vows to God were to be taken incredibly seriously. They were. It was a vow before God. You had to do it, except Israel's own laws contained pathways for vows to be redeemed, confessed, released. Which means the story shows us what happens when you do what you think is right without knowing what is right. After all, God forbids the cruel and violent actions. He specifically instructs them not to have child sacrifice. God abhors it throughout the whole Bible. And because he does, there's a way out of this foolish vow. There's a way to actually redeem this vow and not follow through. But Jephthah doesn't know it. For him, God is like all the other gods. Jephthah is also a deeply wounded person, right? Long before he ever becomes this leader, he's introduced to us as son of a prostitute from a rejected family. He's rejected. He's not wanted. He's driven away by his brother. They tell him, you do not belong here. And he carries that wound with him. And the wound seems to become an important part of what actually drives him. Because he becomes a valiant warrior, a fighter, a man who gets things done, a man who wins. And many of us may know how often wounds can produce exactly that kind of result. Resilience is good. Determination is good. Learning how to endure, adapt, and carry responsibility. These are good and important strengths. They are. But when strengths are being carried by unhealed wounds, wounds that have never been named, attended to, or healed, they begin to wound others. Because unhealed wounds do not simply disappear, they often continue shaping how a person sees the world, interprets relationships, and responds to life. And over time, what once helped us survive can begin to distort how we see ourselves, how we see others, and how we see God. We begin to imagine a God who works the way our wounds expect the world to work. A God who must be managed, persuaded, negotiated with. A God who rewards strength, secures outcomes, and blesses whatever gets results. And in a world obsessed with results, we often assume that if something worked, it must have been right. At the center of our Christian faith is this reality. If you want to know what God is like, you must look at Jesus.